Yes.
Dr. Williamson, I've got just a handful of questions that cover the range of things we've discussed today. Firstly, by the time you left Sheffield during your specialist registrar years, did you consider it to be an inevitability that haemophiliacs who'd received pooled products would be infected with hepatitis?
Yes.
And how, if at all, and that many of them were infected with HIV, how, if at all, did your knowledge of the infection of haemophiliacs affect your thinking about risks of blood and blood products subsequently through your career?
Oh, I think it had quite a profound effect because, you know, this wasn't just numbers on a spreadsheet or a scientific paper in a journal. This was people I knew, people I'd seen in a clinic. And now they were infected. And the realization, although I was only there 3 years, as to how that hepatitis could progress into something even worse. So I think it did have quite an effect, yes.
We spoke about solvent detergent FFP in the 1990s.
Yes.
Can you clarify when it was devised, the method of solvent detergent FFP?
It was first applied to clotting factor concentrates in commercial organisations in the States.
And would that have been in about the early 1980s?
I can't be sure exactly. There was certainly concern because there had been transmissions of hepatitis A from those concentrates, because that's one of the viruses that doesn't have the fatty coat I was talking about. So when the solvent detergent FFP came along, there were concerns about it. So the solvent detergent FFP method was invented in the New York Blood Center and developed there before it was licensed to the European company Optipharma.
I'm asked to ask you if you understood that it had been devised by someone called Dr. Edward Shanbrom in the early 1980s and then sold to the New York Center under patent, or perhaps that's not something you can assist us with.
I don't know about the clotting factor concentrate part. The person I remember from the New York Blood Center was a Dr. Horowitz, because I suppose it may have had to be modified to apply it to whole plasma as opposed to clotting factor concentrates.
And I'm asked to ask you that if given that it was in existence in the 80s, could it have been developed for use in the UK earlier as well?
Sorry, do you mean in relation to clotting factor concentrates or fresh frozen plasma? Both. I don't know the timings of when it was available. I mean, I recall both BPL and Protein Fractionation Centre in Scotland were very focused on developing heat treatment. I'm sure they must have been aware of the solvent detergent method. Why that wasn't pursued, I'm afraid I don't know.
Can I turn you to a document we looked at before, NHBT 0010585_002. It's the document from Dr. Urhand that we looked at, that he wrote in 1990. And if we turn to page 17, please. We can see in 8.2.1 reference to ALT testing as a surrogate test on apheresis plasma, and that was needed because the BPL has agreed to work under a Qatar license for intravenous gamma globulin production. The BPL will partially compensate for the testing, but their extra payments are not cost effective. An increase in budgets required for ALT testing. Was surrogate testing introduced, first of all, at the East Anglia Transfusion Centre?
No, it was not. No, this document was written in 1990, that's right, and hepatitis C screening came in 1991. Now, there had been much discussion nationally about ALT testing on and off, I think, throughout the 80s. But it was never brought in routinely, as far as I know, in any blood centre, nor was it mandated by the Department of Health. So I think by this point, actually, it became superfluous once hepatitis C screening came into play.
And in terms of the Cambridge Centre, surrogate testing wasn't pursued.
No.
We talked about the provision of plasma to BPL, and that point in time when you were involved with the discussions that there was more plasma that Cambridge could provide to BPL, but they couldn't take it. Were you told at any point why BPL were unable to take all the plasma?
I thought in the early 90s it was because they'd reached the limit of their manufacturing capacity. Later documents suggest part of it may have been that they may have had a stockpile, I'm not sure, but there was also anticipation of recombinant factor VIII coming into play. But I don't recall us explicitly being told why they couldn't take any more at the time.
And did you consider sending the extra plasma up to Edinburgh, to the PFC?
I don't think we did. No, we didn't. I think we were under the impression PFC was also working at full capacity.
The inquiry heard evidence yesterday from Dr. Gallia, who was based in Scotland. Obviously, in Scotland, the situation was slightly different because they also did the hospital blood banking. He gave evidence in relation to the Scottish centres setting maximum blood schedules, specifying the amount of blood that should generally be used. As I say, obviously, it's slightly different in England to Scotland. But were you aware of anything like that level of guidance in the 1990s that was provided within England?
Oh, yes. It would be called a maximum blood ordering schedule. And I think it was routine in hospitals. So what it defined was how many units of blood would be set aside for a given operation with the patient's name on it to be kept for that patient, for that surgery. And it was based really on custom and practice, not necessarily top quality evidence about what was best for the patient. So, for example, hip replacement always had two units of red cells put to one side. Gallbladder surgery, before it was keyhole, had 2 units put to one side. A liver transplant had 30 units put to one side. And then for operations where transfusion was much less likely, there was what was called a group and screen. So the patient's blood group would be determined. It would be checked to make sure there were no antibodies that would make matched blood difficult to find, but no blood would be put aside. So that was actually quite a routine thing to have. And we worked with the hospitals to have a look at their maximum blood ordering schedules and make sure they weren't ridiculous. Because, of course, if blood was set aside for a patient, and it might be kept aside for several days after the surgery, it ran the risk of not being available to be used for someone else within its shelf life. So if you overdid the cross-matching, you were going to have more outdates. So it was in everyone's best interest to set aside as little as possible.
And were those schedules produced by the hospital, and you then had a look at them, or was there more centralisation on what levels would be put on those schedules?
In East Anglia, they were produced by the hospitals. And I think they probably compared notes because the scientists who were in charge of the blood transfusion laboratories in each hospital worked quite closely together, and there was quite good sharing of information around East Anglia.
You talked earlier about blood being supplied to US military bases in your region, and that further tests were required by the FDA in relation to those blood supplies. What were those further tests that were required on US military blood that weren't required on UK blood?
So, of course, in the 1980s, the US had introduced surrogate testing for non-A, non-B hepatitis. So they had introduced both ALT and anti-hepatitis B core, which was thought to identify high-risk donors in a general sense. So any blood that was supplied to the US military had to be tested for those as well.
And if donations were rejected under the FDA standards, but were permitted under UK standards, what happened to those blood components?
I don't recall that ever arising, actually. I can't recall.
Can you give us any indication of how many donations were rejected under FDA standards?
No, I mean, the military hospital they didn't take very much blood from us at all because, thankfully, they weren't dealing with military casualties. So blood was provided for the sort of routine surgery that the staff and their families might have to have. So it wasn't very much per month. So I don't recall it being a big issue that we identified units that had to be rejected.
And in terms of BCJD, when was the process of leukocyte depletion moved into the blood centre?
Well, I think in different parts of the country, there was slightly different practice before variant CJD came along. So because we had done research into bedside filtration, we started to offer blood that had been leukocyte depleted in the blood centre for the clinical indications that were already recommended. So patients with terrible shivery fever reactions being the main one. Other centres may have carried on having bedside filtration until the variant CJD leukodepletion project kicked off, and then everything was in the blood centre.
So from that, it seems likely that it came into the East Anglia Centre before other centres in the UK.
Well, not necessarily before all of them. Some of the others might have done the same thing.
Yeah. Okay. Let me just check behind me, sir. All the questions I have been asked to ask from the call participants, sir.
Well, I have none of my own.
Sorry?
I have none of my own.
Dr. Williamson, is there anything you would like to add at the end of your evidence?
Well, I think just to go back to where I started this morning, which was to express the sorrow I felt hearing and reading your stories. Each and every single one is tragic. And so I can again say a heartfelt sorry to everyone for what has happened.
Can I thank you for your evidence, for the clarity which it had. You are, if I may say so, a very good communicator, and I'd far rather have you explain some of the technicalities to me than some of the other witnesses we've had, without any adverse reflection on them. It's really a credit to you, and the accessibility and the practicality with which you've approached some of the issues, and for its humanity. Some of your observations, if I again may say so, seem to have a compelling simplicity about them. For instance, when you're discussing the question of whether Cambridge should begin testing for HCV before other centres did in 1991, you observed, the general feeling was, if we're ready, why not go? What would be the point of waiting? And another example, perhaps, is when you were commenting on the paternalistic nature, as it seemed to you, of medicine, when it was dealing with whether people should be told whether they had non-A, non-B, or hepatitis C, and indeed the MSBT, for a point, that because you've got no specific treatment to offer people, they shouldn't be told. And you said, which of course with hindsight is ridiculous. And so there's a simplicity and clarity about that, which is very, very welcome. Thank you very much indeed.
So tomorrow we will hear from Dr. Hewitt. I want to just highlight one matter in relation to that, There have been 3 witness statements that have been provided to the inquiry in response to a request to the NHSBT for evidence on lookbacks. They were provided by Dr. Williamson, we've looked at hers, by Dr. Hewitt, as I say, we'll be hearing from her tomorrow, and from Dr. Angela Robinson. Dr. Robinson also provided a statement in her capacity as Regional Transfusion Director of Yorkshire and the Director of MBA. It may be that Dr. Robinson's look-back statement is referred to in the course of Dr. Hewitt's evidence tomorrow. Dr. Robinson's statements are unsigned, but in final form and were approved by her. I'm sorry to have to say that Dr. Robinson died at the weekend, and so the unsigned statements represent her evidence to the inquiry. The inquiry is very grateful to Dr. Robinson for the assistance she provided to the inquiry, which will be invaluable in furthering the inquiry's understanding of the work of the blood services and the NBA.
Well, thank you very much for telling us that. Tomorrow then, 10 o'clock. 10 o'clock.